That's the live stream up and running.
Okay, thank you, Graham. Hello and welcome everybody to this 8th day of the Clauchrie Wind Farm Inquiry. This morning we'll be holding a session with the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire Biosphere. I first ask the parties to introduce themselves and just check that the technology is working. First of all, Mr. Thompson, I can see you there. Can I hear you?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Thank you, reporter. I'm John Thompson. As I explained in my precognition, I'm a trustee of the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire Biosphere Reserve.
Good, thank you. And who's representing the applicant today?
Morning, sir. Excuse me, Ewan MacLeod, Solicitor of the Shepherd and Wedderburn, and I'm representing the applicant today.
Thank you. And I think we don't have anybody from the council today, so I think it's just the three of us today. Is there anyone else here that's expecting to speak? Good. As usual, can I remind people to please mute yourselves when not speaking, and for those who aren't participating in the hearing to turn your videos off. I made various announcements at the start of the inquiry regarding such matters as the webcasting of proceedings, COVID restrictions, and the inquiry and timetable process. I won't repeat those now, but they can be viewed on the webcast for the 24th of May, available on the DPEA webcasting site. Now, Mr. Thompson, you've submitted a statement and a summary statement. I'll ask you to read out your shorter statement in a moment, and you can enlarge upon any of the points that you make as you go along or at the end. I'm hoping today can be quite informal. The purpose of these sessions was to be available for participants who want to speak in a more informal manner about the range of their concerns rather than having to attend the individual formal inquiry sessions. But the applicant may have some questions for you at the end, and I know I've got a few points to ask you about as well, and then I'll give you an opportunity to make any final comments before we close at the end of the day. So any points anyone wants to make about the procedure for today at this stage, or shall we go ahead?
I just had, can you hear me okay, sir?
Yes, Mr. MacLeod.
Yes, Mr. MacLeod. Just by way of clarification, excuse me, I'm not intending to ask Mr. Thompson any questions today. I've got one very short statement to make after his statement, but that will be it. And I'm mindful of your comments that this is intended to be an informal session, and I'm treating it that way myself. Okay, that's fine. Thank you. So I'll come to you after we've heard from Mr. MacLeod, and then I'll maybe ask my questions after I've heard from you. Then if I could turn to you, Mr. Thompson, and ask you to read your shorter statement, please.
Thank you very much. My name's John Thompson, as I've said. I'm a trustee of the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire Biosphere Partnership, and it's in that capacity and on behalf of the Partnership Board that I'm making this statement. The Partnership Board set out its reasons for objecting to this proposed development in an assessment sent under cover of a letter of the 12th of March 2020, signed by the Biosphere Project Coordinator, Ed Forrest. These reasons related primarily to the potential landscape and visual impacts of the wind farm on the core and buffer area of the biosphere, and the consequential adverse effect on local tourism and sense of place. The statement went on to describe these impacts in greater detail, outlining the purposes and international standing of the Biosphere Reserve, and highlighting in particular the obligation that these impose to safeguard the character and qualities of the core area. It also explained the role of the buffer in achieving this aim, and the conclusions that this had led the Partnership Board to draw about the types of development that would be acceptable within it. In essence, these comprise low-key developments that support sustainable tourism and contribute towards ecological connectivity, peatland restoration, and the creation of open ground habitats. My previous written submission elaborated the background to this highly unusual intervention by the Partnership Board. As it made clear, the Biosphere Partnership has no formal role within the planning system. For that and other reasons, it as a general rule avoids involvement in development management cases. It was only after considerable internal debate that it decided to depart from that general stance and to lodge an objection to this particular application. It did so on the basis that it would be very hard to envisage any form of development that would be more damaging to key attributes of the biosphere's core area, or more at odds with the overall approach to development in the buffer zone described, than very tall turbines of the kind proposed. The principal specific attributes involved are wildland character, as reflected in the identification of the Merrick Kells by Scottish Natural Heritage as one of the only 2 locations in the south of Scotland possessing such qualities to the degree required for recognition, and the near absence of artificial lighting, acknowledged through its status as a gold tier dark sky park. Additionally, however, the board felt that development on this massive scale also posed a significant threat to the broader character of the area, as perceived by locals and visitors alike. This sense of place depends very much on the biosphere's image as a terrain where natural features and processes predominate, even when some of these are heavily influenced by human activity. In the contemporary world, such attributes are increasingly valued. The resulting potential to stimulate tourism was a significant factor in the original decision to nominate Galloway in Southern Ayrshire as a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. All this matters because UNESCO biospheres are an important international designation and mark of significance. Scotland has only 2 in Galloway and Wester Ross. Across the UK, there are only another 4, with the Isle of Man as a 5th. Most of those south of the border overlap at least in part with a national park. These numbers and this coincidence signals that they are somewhere special and should be treated as such. As to their management, my written submission explains that zonation is fundamental to the whole concept of the new style biosphere reserve, as developed from the 1980s onwards. In this model, the role of the buffer zone, within which this proposed development lies, is very much to protect the qualities of the core area. It is a place where, I quote, only activities compatible with the conservation objectives for that core can take place. Importantly, as all the relevant UNESCO guidance makes clear, the buffer zone is intrinsic to the purpose and integrity of the biosphere designation. It is not some sort of add-on or afterthought. In common with biospheres across the globe, the core area of the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire biosphere was initially identified on the basis of its biodiversity interests. Over time, however, the concept and objectives of the biosphere designation have evolved. The conservation goals now explicitly relate to landscapes as well as to species and ecosystems. And more broadly, the role of biosphere reserves is seen as being, I quote, to promote and demonstrate a balanced relationship between humans and the biosphere. In other words, a harmonious interaction between people and nature. This is not just a matter of managing resources sustainably in the outer transition zone. It also involves appreciating and valuing a wider range of attributes, including those that are most often brigaded under the title of cultural ecosystem services. These include recreational and experiential qualities such as tranquility and the absence of light pollution and of obtrusive human artifacts. The principle of environmental care is absolutely central to the attainment of this ambitious agenda. And whilst it applies throughout, it inevitably takes on particular force in relation to the core and buffer zones. In practice, the core is only a tiny 2% of the total area of the biosphere. Together, the 2 zones comprise less than 20% of it. So if these crucial areas are not treated with great care, what is the point of the whole designation? That is a question that could well be asked when Galloway and the Southern Ayrshire Biosphere comes up for its scheduled 10-yearly review next year in 2022. As mentioned earlier, and as I hope my written submission made clear, the Partnership Board thought long and hard before objecting to this application. its members are fully alive to the existential dangers posed by climate change and of the urgency required in tackling it. Indeed, one of the partnership's early priorities was the preparation of a climate-ready biosphere action plan. The board also accepts that increased renewable energy generation will be a crucial element within the overall effort to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. It's not anti-wind farm. The partnership has adopted make it clear that wind farms can be acceptable in the transition zone if they enjoy community support and their environmental impact can be adequately contained. The partnership board recognises that because biosphere reserves are not a recognised planning designation, Scottish planning policy does not preclude their construction even in the core and buffer zones. But given the presumption against them that it establishes for nationally designated landscapes, such as national parks and national scenic areas, logic surely suggests the most sensitive parts of an area internationally recognised for its environmental importance should receive a similar level of protection. In the absence of clear national policy, the Partnership Board looked elsewhere for guidance. My written submission describes in some detail how it explored relevant UNESCO documents for a steer on the issues raised by this particular application. Nothing definitive emerged from this investigation, but as the excerpts cited in the submission show, such pointers as there are underline the need for caution in permitting any activities in the buffer zone that pose a threat to the qualities of the core or are out of keeping with traditional low-impact uses of the buffer itself. Interestingly, the nomination form for the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire Biosphere Reserve itself contained the least equivocal guidance, notably in its remarks about the acceptability of wind farm development in the transition zone. This document, which was of course approved by both the Scottish and the UK governments, left no doubt about the care required, and I quote, "The uncontrolled spread of wind farms could have a detrimental impact on the landscape and on the attractiveness of the area, and care needs to be taken to ensure that wind farms are only allowed where the impacts are minimal." The Partnership Board does not believe that turbines of the scale proposed are compatible with this enjoinder, or indeed with the proper protection of the interests of the biosphere's core zone. It is also clear from discussions within the International Biosphere Network that the issue of what development is appropriate within buffer zones is increasingly recognised as an important one, with renewable energy development being a facet of it arousing particular interest, given the potential clash of environmental interests and objectives. For that reason, the decision on this specific case will be watched closely, not just here in the UK, but across the globe. Against this background, the Biosphere Partnership Board very much hopes that citizens will recognise the potentially far-reaching repercussions of the decision that they make, not just for the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire biosphere, but for biosphere policy more widely. In this case, Scotland may well be setting an important precedent as a country that aspires to lead the world in the move to a greener, zero-carbon economy, an environmentally sustainable society. It should surely be setting the right one. This involves, according to the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire biosphere, the careful treatment it deserves, as all involved in caring for it seek to answer the question that summarises the challenge that UNESCO has set for it and all its fellow biospheres. And again, I quote from UNESCO, "How can we reconcile the conservation of biodiversity, the quest for economic and social development, and the maintenance of associated cultural values?" In nominating the area for designation by UNESCO, Scottish ministers subscribed to this ambition and taxing objective. The Partnership Board is charged with taking the lead in pursuing it. In its carefully considered view, achieving it requires Scottish ministers to refuse permission for the proposed Clauchrie wind farm. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Thompson. Mr. MacLeod, you had a statement in response.
I do, sir, yes, and it's a very brief one, as I indicated. Mr. Thompson, the partnership has made to the application, and The applicant has already addressed that objection in its planning and energy policy hearing statement. And really just for your reference, sir, page 35 of the planning and energy policy hearing statement, section 4.9.2 to 4.9.8 sets out the applicant's response to the objection and, in effect, the applicant's response to Mr. Thompson's statement today.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Thompson,
That's all I have to say.
No, thank you, Mr. McLeod. Mr. Thompson, I take it you've not seen that reference that Mr. McLeod's just pointed us to.
No, I don't think I have. I've only been able to dip into the other documents presented to the inquiry because I just haven't had the time, as I'm a volunteer trustee of the board.
Well, let's have a quick look at what the applicant's saying there. Then.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest, sir, would it be helpful for Mr. Thompson if I was just to read it out? It's only a few paragraphs long.
Yes, that would be certainly save me the time of doing the same thing. So yes, please do.
Certainly. Okay. So this is, as I said, beginning on page 35 of the planning and energy policy hearing statement at paragraph 4.9.2. The objection from the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire Biosphere Partnership is dated 12 March 2020. It sets out that the organisation objects to the proposed development on the grounds of landscape and visual effects on the core and buffer area of the UNESCO biosphere, and as a result, GSAB contends that there would be a consequential adverse effect on local tourism and sense of place. The GASB references assets within it which they consider require significant protection from the impact of wind farm development. The assets listed include wildland, carbon-rich soils, Natura 2000 sites, designated landscapes, and historic battlefields, etc. These are all matters, however, which are set out in Group 2 of the SPP, that's Scottish Planning Policy, Spatial Framework Approach. SPP states that in these areas, wind farms may be appropriate in some circumstances. Further consideration will be required to demonstrate any significant effects on the qualities of these areas can be substantively overcome, siting, design, or other mitigation. As explained in the following chapter in relation to national planning policy and guidance, the Group 2 issue that is engaged by the proposed development is carbon-rich soils. It's been explained in the previous sections, that's of this hearing statement, that there would be no significant effects arising in relation to that resource. The proposed development is located within the buffer zone of the biosphere, and the GSAB sets out that this covers an area of 845 square kilometres. The GSAB sets out on page 3 of their objection that, in their view, any wind farm developments within the core and buffer zone of the biosphere would not be suitable or supported due to their adverse impact on the region's natural environment, sense of place, and rural economy. In effect, the GSAB take the position that there should be an embargo on wind development within these areas. It's considered that such an approach would be entirely contrary to Scottish planning policy and the Group 2 spatial framework approach. The GSAB objection addresses in some detail the matter of effects of the proposed development on landscape character, effects in relation to scenic landscapes, wildland, and visual impact with reference to a number of viewpoints. Further, tourism matters are raised together with issues in relation to the Dark Sky Park. These specific topics are referenced in the sections above, again that's a reference to the hearing statement, and are addressed by the applicant's expert witnesses, namely in relation to landscape and visual, tourism and recreation. The information provided above on all these topics in relation to the SAC objection should be referred to for its detail. So sorry, that's a reference to the South Ayrshire Council objection as well. The GSAB also makes reference to section 11 of their objection to Scottish planning policy, and they repeat the reference to the policy approach of significant protection for various national interests. Again, these relate to the Group 2 interests which the applicant has addressed in its siting and design approach and which are referenced in the EIA report. The final section of the GSAB objection sets out that the organisation considers the proposed development as contrary to the relevant development plans for the area. Dumfries and Galloway Council has taken the position the proposed development would accord with the development plan. As explained in the above sections, the applicant's position is that the proposed development is in accordance with the relevant policies of both council development plans and with the plans when read as a whole.
Thank you, Mr. MacLeod. Mr. Thompson, having heard that, do you have any comments to make?
Yes, although I wasn't familiar with all the detail of that, I was aware of the general line that had been taken by the applicant in response to our original objection. Essentially, we felt it right to leave to others who were better qualified and had access to the necessary resources to make the detailed arguments in relation to landscape and visual impact and impact on dark skies and so forth. So we deliberately decided, because those issues were being pursued by others, both South Ayrshire Council and Nature Scott in some cases, and organisations like the Mountaineering Council, that we would leave them to deal with those issues, which is why I, in my subsequent written submission and statement, concentrated on the standing of the biosphere as an international designation. And I think the fundamental problem that we all face is that biospheres do not currently feature in Scottish planning policy in the way that arguably they ought to. And therefore I'm highlighting in my statement the fact that, in effect, this particular proposal is putting the Scottish ministers on notice that biospheres need to be in some way incorporated into planning policy, because otherwise they're going to be significantly out of step with international thinking about biosphere reserves.
Okay, thank you. I've a few questions for you. Just bear with me. Yeah, I mean, first of all, just so I'm absolutely clear about the extent of the biosphere and the different types, the core area, the buffer area, and the transition area. I don't think we have a map before the inquiry, or if we do, I haven't been able to find it, defining exactly where these are. We've got, I don't know if you, figure 3.2 of the EIA report shows part of it. It shows an area of around 10 to 15 kilometres around the application site, and it shows the boundary of the core area around the Merrick, and I suppose it's the northwestern boundary of the buffer zone. But in the absence of a map, can I just I confess I have been on the internet to see what the boundaries are, but just for the record for the inquiry, my understanding is that the core area is a tightly drawn area around the Merrick itself and the Rins of Kells and Cairnsmore of Fleet. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's also Silver Flow, which is to the east of the Merrick. But yes, it is a tightly drawn group of areas.
So Silver Flow is in the wildland area just immediately to the east of the Merrick, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the buffer area, it seems to very approximately be equivalent to the area of the Galloway Forest Park and the dark sky buffer area. There are a few differences here and there, but broadly it's that sort of extent.
Yes, that's correct. And I think it's fair to say that the thinking at the time that the area was nominated for designation was that the fact that the great majority of ground within the Galloway Forest Park, or the area broadly described by the Galloway Forest Park was in state ownership, meant that it lent itself particularly well to buffer zone status, because it was an area that could very easily be regulated and controlled by government. And obviously, if you're thinking of a buffer area as an area for protecting the interests of the core, then the fact that it's in the control of a single, largely in control of a single body, and indeed that single body is the government, makes it particularly suitable for that purpose.
Thank you. And then the transition area, this is the broader area that covers a large part of southwest Scotland, from the southern edge of Ayr down to Castle Douglas.
Yes.
So it's much broader. Yeah.
Yes, as I pointed out in my statement, roughly, rather over 80% of the total biosphere is in that outer transition zone.
Yeah.
And only roughly 16% within the buffer.
Okay. And is it the case that there are no commercial wind farms in the core zone or the buffer zone at the moment? So would this be the first one?
This would be the first one, yes. There are wind farms, obviously, in quite large numbers in the transition zone, but this would be the first encroachment into the core or buffer.
Sorry, I'm just pausing while I write down your answers. So. Now, the objection you've made, I wasn't quite clear whether, would you characterize this as an in principle objection, coming out of the biosphere's general policy stance that wind farms are unsuitable in the buffer zone? Or does it originate from particular concerns you have about the design and location of this specific proposal?
I would say it is an in principle objection, which is not to say that we would completely rule out the possibility of small scale renewable energy developments within the buffer zone, but they would obviously have to be ones that respected the character of that zone, which I think is very much in keeping with the guidance that both UNESCO themselves and IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, have been developing on development in such sensitive areas. So to take a possible example, one could see that maybe a small-scale run-of-the-river renewable scheme would be entirely appropriate within the buffer zone. But I think when we're talking about a commercial wind farm on this scale, and I would emphasize that the fact that these are 200-meter turbines, roughly speaking, is a significant factor in our thinking. These are very large structures indeed, with the additional issue that they may have to be lit. I know there may be technological answers to that, but the structures themselves are so large that they would inevitably be very intrusive. And as I've said in my statement, as we said originally, we don't think human artifacts on that scale are appropriate in the buffer zone.
Okay, so is it fair to say that you haven't done a detail? I mean, you said you've left the detail to others at this inquiry, and in approach to this application, you haven't yourself done a detailed sort of landscape and visual assessment or critique of the applicant's assessment. It's more high level, if you like.
We haven't. I mean, the biosphere, as I say, it doesn't have a statutory planning function, and it also has extremely limited resources of its own. So we weren't in a position to undertake that sort of study.
Thank you. Now, the biosphere seems to have a few different strands to it, or the biosphere philosophy or concept. It's not just about landscape, it's also about biodiversity and cultural aspects as well. But would I be right in thinking that your concern here is essentially about landscape and visual impact, as opposed to, say, ecological damage or cultural impacts or any other aspect?
I think you're right in terms of ecological damage, and we're not arguing, in response to Mr. McLeod's point, we're not arguing about very substantial damage to carbon-rich soils, for example. We are talking more about landscape and visual impact, but I don't think you can dissociate that from cultural impacts in the broad sense. If we're talking about cultural landscapes that are appreciated by people for certain attributes, then I think we're very much talking about that. And that's where the sense of place concept comes into play, because again, as I said, in this case, I think in my written submission rather than the statement that I've just read, people, even although the forest park is essentially a man-made creation, it's a large-scale afforestation scheme. It isn't a natural landscape in an ecological sense. Although clearly in the past much of the area would have been forested naturally, but the forest that exists there is not a natural forest. But nonetheless, in most people's mind, it is a relatively natural area. It is not an area characterized by very obvious human artifacts, and that's where as I say, the sense of place comes in, and the idea that this is an area of peace and tranquility, relatively speaking. Certainly the very substantial absence of light pollution, all of which would be significantly disrupted by a built development on this sort of scale.
So the underlying assumption then behind your objection is that wind farms are damaging to the landscape, because I think we've heard, or you know, a contrary view could be put that this is a simple, relatively simple, large-scale plateau landscape that could accommodate wind farms relatively well.
Yes, I think it's inherent in most of the guidance that's a policy really that relates to wind farm development, that wind farms, and particularly wind farms involving turbines on a very large scale, have the capacity to be damaging to the landscape. That some landscapes are better able to accommodate them than others, which is the point you're making about the character of this particular landscape. And that is no doubt true, but you then get into the question of how far are landscapes valued for the absence of such human artifacts. And we're saying in relation to this particular landscape, it is valued for that, as I've just been saying. And not only is it valued for that, but actually its value is recognized through its designation as an internationally recognized biosphere. So there is something special about it, and that means that you have to ask very hard questions about developments that might be at variance with and destructive of the character of that particular landscape.
Thank you. And just one other question, which was, I suppose, coming back to the concept of biospheres and the nature of the way they're designated by UNESCO, and I suppose the history of the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire biosphere as well, and how far, if you could just tell me how biospheres come into being and whether they are, if you like, self-selecting. Is it that local people see an advantage or a reason to seek out designation, and they approach UNESCO and say, we think this is a suitable, or that government do, we think this is a suitable place, and do we meet your criteria? Or is it that UNESCO globally look around the world and they pick the best areas in the way that a government might identify listed buildings, for instance, as being a top-down seeking out of the best areas? You just explain how it works.
Well, it's a combination of the two approaches. So UNESCO doesn't initiate the process. UNESCO doesn't scour the world and say, where are the very best areas that should be designated as biospheres? That isn't the process, and I guess you would understand that. I mean, that's by and large not the way that that kind of international organization operates. So the initiative for putting forward an area as a biosphere reserve lies with the member governments of UNESCO. So in this case, the UK government, in turn, given the devolution of responsibility for environmental policy, the UK government as advised and prompted by the Scottish government. So the initiative lies with government, and to that extent, it's top down, but at the national level. However, the way in which biospheres have come to be designated now has a much stronger bottom-up component. And if I just elaborate a little bit on the history of the Galloway Southern Ayrshire biosphere, when the original biosphere reserve was created, and I'm not sure about the exact dates of that, I'm afraid, but we're going back probably to about the 1960s. What the government then did was ask its nature conservation advisors, and Nature Conservancy or Nature Conservancy Council, to come up with some suitable sites for potential designation as biospheres. And that was the origin of most of, at least, what is currently the core area of this biosphere. So it was very much, if you like, a science-led expert procedure at that stage. However, as I explained in my submission, the concept of biospheres was then further developed, and it was further developed not just in the light of wider environmental and ecological thinking, but even more so in terms of the relationship between people and their environment, and the recognition that care for any environmental resource really depended on the support and, if possible, active cooperation of local people. And that resulted in this concept of the three-tier, three-zone biosphere that the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire biosphere incorporates, reflects. And so when the biosphere came up for review, there was a very extensive consultation exercise carried out to see not just whether it still sort of fulfilled the environmental requirements for a biosphere, but also whether the idea of designating it as a new style biosphere, three-zone biosphere, enjoyed local support. And people, for example, were taken from the area to see new style biospheres elsewhere in the world, including the Cevennes in France, which was quite a well-known example. And it was as a result of that process that it was decided to go ahead and seek recognition as a new style biosphere. So to that extent, it was a bottom-up process, although it was one that was initiated by government and required government support to go forward to UNESCO for designation. So it was very much a combination of the top-down and the bottom-up, but over time with an increasing emphasis on the bottom-up.
So when you talk about a new style biosphere, that's the three-tier approach, is it? And that's not particular to Galloway and Southern Ayrshire. That's a sort of new approach being rolled out across the world.
Indeed, yes. As I say, it was initiated. I mean, the Cevennes in France was one of the early examples, but it is a worldwide process, and it's certainly reflected in the nature of the other UK biospheres, including that in Wester Ross, the other example in Scotland, where the core area is actually the Ben A National Nature Reserve.
So, with the nature of that history, then there's no suggestion that Wester Ross and Galloway and Southern Ayrshire are necessarily the most important areas for landscape or biodiversity or cultural relationship with the landscape in Scotland. The reason why those two have been picked out is due to particular factors of the history in those areas or being given as examples. But there may be other parts of Scotland and the UK that are equally or more valuable.
Yes, I wouldn't say that they have been selected as absolutely the best possible examples, but at the same time, their original selection reflected the fact that there were areas that were highly designated for their nature conservation interest. They obviously weren't unique in that, but they certainly satisfied the criteria for selection as national nature reserves, SSSIs, Ramsar sites, etc., etc. I don't think anybody would deny that whilst they might not be the two very best sites in the country, they're up there amongst the best in the country. They wouldn't be UNESCO reserves if they weren't. UNESCO wouldn't have been convinced, and neither, for that matter, would the Scottish and UK governments.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I didn't have any other questions. I don't know if there's anything further you want to say, just in summary, or to close your submission to the inquiry.
Well, I think probably just a couple of points. The first of which relates to what I was saying about the eyes of the world being on this particular proposal. And we have indeed had a visit relatively recently from a representative on the UK Commission for UNESCO. I wouldn't want necessarily to cite him without checking that he was happy to be cited, but I think I can say that his general response to the issue here was a biosphere can only be where a biosphere is. That is, you have to apply the criteria that are applied in designating a biosphere to decide where a biosphere should be. A wind farm, you have a much wider choice of potential sites, and that is certainly recognised in the policy that the Biosphere Partnership has adopted, where it has made it quite clear that it recognises that in the transition zone, which as I've said is over 80% of the total biosphere, there may well be suitable opportunities for wind farm development, and indeed wind farms have been developed, and the biosphere has not objected to any of those, although it has made it clear that it believes that considerable sensitivity is required in selecting a site, and obviously the views of the local communities are important. And the second point, I just refer back to the quote that I gave in my statement from the original nomination, which demonstrated, I think, obviously beyond dispute that the Scottish and UK governments themselves recognise that wind farm development could have a severe impact on a biosphere and therefore required very careful siting and design, with the implication that really the only place that it was likely to be acceptable within the biosphere reserve was the transition zone. It didn't say it in quite those terms, but I think it's a logical inference to draw from the wording of that nomination paper. I just want to close, therefore, by highlighting the fact that I think biospheres, and particularly the core and buffer areas of biospheres, should be regarded as areas of very considerable environmental sensitivity.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Thompson, for your time today. I think we can probably leave it there. So I've made note of what you said, and I'll certainly give it further thoughts. So thank you for your attendance today, and I'll finish there. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.